In a rundown apartment complex, Eli Parker is a resourceful teenager living a modest life with his hardworking mother. A chance encounter with a broken flower pot and an elderly neighbor's gratitude sets him on an unexpected path. With only a worn toolbox and his wits, Eli begins fixing everything from heaters to radios, unknowingly repairing more than just objects. He's mending his own sense of purpose. But as Eli's skills draw attention, he's offered a life-changing opportunity, a chance to compete for a scholarship that could secure his future. Balancing self-doubt, financial struggles, and the weight of others' expectations, Eli faces challenges that test not just his abilities, but his courage to dream big. How far can kindness and determination take a boy who once doubted himself? And what happens when unexpected kindness from strangers changes everything? Eli Parker adjusted the strap of his worn-out backpack as he climbed the creaky stairs of his apartment building. His sneakers scuffed the peeling linoleum, echoing softly in the empty stairwell. The smell of cooked onions lingered in the air, a reminder of the dinners prepared in the cramped kitchens throughout the building. He reached the door marked with a crooked 3B and fumbled with the key, the chipped brass rough against his fingers. Inside, the tiny apartment greeted him with its usual silence. The living room doubled as his mother's bedroom, her pull-out couch tucked neatly back into its daytime position. A small table stood by the window, cluttered with unpaid bills and a chipped mug holding pens and loose change. Eli's room, no bigger than a closet, held a twin bed, a stack of secondhand books, and a desk made of mismatched wooden planks he had nailed together himself. He tossed his bag onto the bed and opened the fridge. The lone carton of milk was nearly empty, and a plastic container of leftover pasta sat on the shelf. He sighed, pouring what was left of the milk into a cracked bowl, then added cereal. As he sat at the kitchen table, the door rattled with a knock. "Just a second," Eli called, setting down his bowl. He opened the door to see Mrs. Turner, his elderly neighbor, standing there, her frail frame bundled in a faded cardigan. She clutched a ceramic flower pot, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly. "Eli, dear, I hate to bother you," but she started, her voice soft and hesitant. "It's no bother, Mrs. Turner." "What's wrong?" Eli asked, stepping aside so she could enter. Mrs. Turner walked carefully to the table, setting the flower pot down like it was made of glass. A jagged crack ran down one side, threatening to split it in two. "This pot belonged to my husband," she explained, her voice trembling. "He used to plant my favorite daisies in it every spring. I tried to fix it, but my hands are not as steady as they used to be." Eli examined the pot, running his fingers over the crack. He glanced at Mrs. Turner, whose eyes were watery with unshed tears. His chest tightened. "I think I can fix it," he said, giving her a small smile. "Oh, bless you, Eli," she said, relief softening her features. Eli rummaged through the kitchen drawer, pulling out a tube of glue that was nearly dried out. He carefully spread it along the crack, holding the pieces together until they set. It wasn't perfect, but the pot held firm. "Good as new," Eli said, handing it back to her. Mrs. Turner's face lit up with a smile, and for a moment, she looked years younger. "Thank you, dear. You don't know what this means to me," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. Eli shrugged, feeling his cheeks warm. "It's nothing, really." Mrs. Turner hesitated at the door as she prepared to leave. "Wait here," she said suddenly, shuffling back to her apartment. When she returned, she was holding a dusty, weathered toolbox. "This belonged to my husband, too," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she offered it to Eli. "I think he would want you to have it. You have a knack for fixing things just like he did." Eli stared at the box, speechless. Its once bright red paint was chipped and scratched, but it was sturdy. He could tell it had been well loved. "I can't take this, Mrs. Turner," Eli stammered. "You can, and you will," she said firmly, her eyes glinting with determination. "It would make me happy to see it being used again." Eli nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner. I promise to take good care of it." As she left, Eli sat down on the floor, opening the box with care. Inside were screwdrivers, pliers, a soldering iron, and other tools, worn but still functional. His fingers brushed over the handles, each piece telling a story of a life lived with care and precision. A small surge of pride swelled in his chest. The toolbox was more than a gift, it was a reminder that someone believed in him. That night, as Eli sat on his bed, the toolbox by his side, he found himself thinking of all the things he could fix. His mother's broken alarm clock, the heater that rattled during the night, maybe even the old radio at the corner store. He lay down, the soft hum of the city filtering through the thin walls. For the first time in a long while, the possibilities seemed endless. Eli woke to the sound of his mother shuffling through the kitchen. He stretched the narrow confines of his room, making it impossible to extend his arms fully. The faint light of dawn filtered through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow over the small space. Maggie Parker was already dressed for her shift at the diner. Her black uniform was neatly pressed, though the edges were fraying, and her shoes had long since lost their shine. She glanced up as Eli stepped out of his room, yawning. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but tired. She set down her coffee cup and gave him a small smile. "There's some toast if you want it." "Thanks, Mom," Eli replied, heading to the toaster. He grabbed a slice and leaned against the counter. Maggie rubbed her temples, her brow furrowed. "The heater's acting up again," she murmured. "It's been rattling all night and blowing cold air. I don't know how much more we can afford to patch it up." Eli glanced toward the corner of the room where the old radiator sat. The sound of its uneven clanking had become part of the apartment's background noise. He thought of the toolbox Mrs. Turner had given him the day before, its contents still spread out on his desk. "Maybe I could take a look at it," Eli offered. Maggie raised an eyebrow, doubt flickering across her face, but she didn't discourage him. "If you think you can, go ahead. Just be careful." "Okay." Eli nodded. After his mom left for work, he grabbed the toolbox and crouched in front of the heater. The metal was cold to the touch, and a faint smell of dust lingered in the air. He unscrewed the front panel and peered inside, squinting at the maze of wires and pipes. The problem wasn't immediately obvious. Eli felt a pang of doubt creep in, but he pushed it aside. He carefully examined the connections, running his fingers over the worn wires. A loose wire near the thermostat caught his attention. It looked like it had been hanging by a thread for weeks. Eli rummaged through the toolbox, pulling out the pliers and a small screwdriver. He tightened the connection, his movements slow and deliberate. After securing the wire, he brushed the dust off the thermostat's casing and reassembled the panel. When he turned the heater back on, it groaned to life. A few seconds later, a soft hum filled the room, and warm air began to flow steadily through the vents. Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and wiped his hands on his jeans. The heater was working. That evening, Maggie came home with her shoulders slumped, her expression weary. She hung her coat on the back of a chair and paused, noticing the warmth in the room. "Eli, did you fix it?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Eli shrugged, trying to downplay his pride. "It just needed a loose wire tightened. Nothing major." Maggie walked over and cupped his face in her hands, her eyes glistening. "You're amazing, you know that? You saved us a service call we couldn't afford." "It's no big deal, Mom," Eli mumbled, though his chest swelled at her praise. Word about Eli's knack for repairs spread quickly through the building. A few days later, Mr. Carter from 2A knocked on their door with a broken table lamp. The following week, a frazzled young mother from 4C asked him to look at her baby monitor. Each time, Eli found a way to fix the problem, the toolbox becoming his constant companion. The residents were grateful. Sometimes they brought him small tokens of thanks, a bag of cookies, a carton of milk, even a pair of gloves from the elderly woman in 1D. Each gesture made Eli realize how much his work meant to them. One evening, as he finished repairing the squeaky hinges on the laundry room door, Mrs. Turner shuffled by with a smile. "You've got a gift, Eli," she said. "Your kindness reminds me of my husband. He was always fixing things for the neighbors." Eli felt a flicker of pride, but also a pang of longing. He wondered if his father would have been proud of him had he been around. Later that night, as he lay in bed, the toolbox resting on the chair beside him, Eli thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. The apartment felt warmer, not just from the fixed heater, but from the connections he was building with his neighbors. And yet, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Fixing things was rewarding, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to do more, to learn more. The repairs had sparked something inside him, a hunger for knowledge and a desire to make something of himself. Eli stared at the ceiling, the faint hum of the heater lulling him to sleep. He didn't know how yet, but he was determined to take the next step. Eli woke to the muffled sound of voices outside his apartment door. It was still early, and the faint morning light seeped through the blinds in his small room. He rubbed his eyes and stretched, listening as the conversation grew louder. Curious, he crept to the door and peeked through the peephole. Mrs. Turner was standing in the hallway, talking to a tall man in a crisp jacket. His neatly combed hair and polished leather shoes stood out sharply against the faded carpet and peeling wallpaper of the old building. Eli didn't recognize him, but he seemed out of place. As Mrs. Turner gestured animatedly, the man nodded and smiled warmly. Eli cracked the door open slightly to hear better. "You should meet him," Mrs. Turner was saying. "That boy is clever and kind, just like my late husband. He's been fixing things for everyone in the building. The heater, the lamps, even my flower pot." The man chuckled. "He sounds impressive. Where can I find him?" Mrs. Turner turned toward Eli's door, and he quickly stepped back, his heart pounding. A moment later, there was a knock. Eli opened the door slowly, looking between Mrs. Turner and the stranger. "Eli, this is Mr. Grayson," Mrs. Turner said, her tone as bright as ever. "He's staying in the building temporarily, while overseeing some renovations downtown. I was just telling him about you." "Nice to meet you, Eli," Mr. Grayson said, extending a hand. His voice was smooth and calm, carrying an air of authority. Eli shook his hand, feeling a bit self-conscious. Nice to meet you too." Mrs. Turner smiled and gave Eli a knowing look before excusing herself, leaving him alone with Mr. Grayson. "I heard you're the go-to handyman around here," Mr. Grayson said, leaning slightly against the doorframe. "I was wondering if you could help me with something." Eli tilted his head. "Sure, what do you need?" "My laptop stopped working last night. It's probably nothing major, but I have some important files I need to access. Think you can take a look?" Eli hesitated. He had fixed plenty of small appliances, but a laptop was more complicated. Still, something about Mr. Grayson's confident demeanor made Eli want to prove himself. "I can try," Eli said, stepping aside to let him in. Mr. Grayson set the laptop on the small kitchen table, and Eli grabbed his toolbox. He opened it carefully, pulling out a screwdriver and a can of compressed air. As he unscrewed the back panel, he asked, "How long has it been acting up?" "Just since yesterday," Mr. Grayson replied, watching intently. "It won't turn on at all?" Eli nodded, his hands moving methodically as he examined the interior. Dust had built up around the fan, and one of the connections near the battery looked loose. "This might be it," Eli muttered, mostly to himself. He cleaned the fan, tightened the connection, and reassembled the laptop. Plugging it in, he pressed the power button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen lit up, and the startup logo appeared. "There it is," Eli said, letting out a breath of relief. Mr. Grayson smiled, clearly impressed. "You got a knack for this, Eli. That was faster than I expected." "It wasn't too bad," Eli said, brushing it off. Mr. Grayson reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $50 bill, holding it out to Eli. "Oh no, I can't take that," Eli said quickly, shaking his head. "I was happy to help." Mr. Grayson paused, then slowly put the bill back into his pocket. "All right, I respect that. But tell me something, Eli, how did you learn to do all this?" Eli hesitated, unsure how to explain. "I just figure things out," he said. "I watch videos online sometimes, and Mrs. Turner gave me her husband's old toolbox. I guess I like fixing things." Mr. Grayson studied Eli for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Have you ever considered doing more with it? Like studying electronics or engineering?" Eli frowned. "I don't know. I've thought about it, but stuff like that costs money. My mom and I, well, we don't have much." Mr. Grayson nodded, as if understanding more than Eli had said. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a business card. He held it out, and Eli reluctantly took it. "Keep this," Mr. Grayson said. "I work for a tech company downtown. We're always looking for young talent, especially people who are self-taught like you." If you're interested in learning more, give me a call. Eli stared at the card. It was simple but professional, with Mr. Grayson's name and the company's logo printed neatly. Thanks, Eli said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Mr. Grayson smiled. No pressure. Just think about it. You've got potential. Eli, don't let it go to waste. After Mr. Grayson left, Eli sat at the table, turning the card over in his hands. His mind buzzed with possibilities, but also with doubts. Could he really do something more? Did he have what it took to succeed in a world he had only glimpsed through videos and articles? When Maggie came home that evening, Eli showed her the card. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression a mix of pride and hesitation. Do you think I could actually do this, Mom? Eli asked, his voice quiet. Maggie pulled him into a hug, her voice thick with emotion. You can do anything you set your mind to, Eli. I've always believed that. As she held him, Eli felt a small flicker of hope in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger. The business card sat on Eli's desk for days, its glossy surface catching the light every time he walked into his room. He couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Grayson's words. You've got potential. Don't let it go to waste. But doubts lingered. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he embarrassed himself? Every time he thought about calling, fear held him back. One afternoon, Eli came home from school to find his mom sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of papers. Bills, as usual. Her face was drawn with worry, her fingers rubbing her temples. Hey, Mom, Eli said, setting his backpack on the floor. She looked up, offering a tired smile. Son, how was school? It was fine, he said, hesitating. He pulled the business card from his pocket, holding it up. I've been thinking about this. Maggie's eyes softened as she took the card. Mr. Grayson seemed like a good man, she said. I think you should call him Eli. What's the worst that could happen? Eli sat down across from her, picking at the edge of the table. I don't know, what if I mess up? What if he expects me to know more than I do? Maggie reached across the table, her hand warm on his. You fixed that laptop without any training. You've been fixing things for the whole building. That didn't happen by accident, Eli. You're smart, and you're resourceful. Give yourself some credit. Eli looked at her, her unwavering belief in him shining through the exhaustion in her eyes. He took a deep breath and nodded. I'll call him, he said. The next morning, Eli dialed the number on the card before he could talk himself out of it. His hands trembled slightly as the phone rang. Hello, this is Mr. Grayson, came the familiar smooth voice. Hi, Mr. Grayson, this is Eli, from the apartment building. Eli, I was hoping you'd call, Grayson said, his tone warm. What can I do for you? I wanted to ask about what you mentioned. Learning more about electronics, Eli said, his voice wavering slightly. Grayson didn't miss a beat. Perfect timing. There's a local tech competition happening soon, sponsored by my company. It's for high school students, and the winners get scholarships to a technical program. I think you'd be a great fit. Eli's heart skipped. A competition? Scholarship? It sounded incredible, but also terrifying. I've never done anything like that before, he admitted. That's what makes it exciting, Grayson said. You've already got the skills, Eli. This could be your chance to show them off. No pressure, though. Just think about it. After hanging up, Eli sat at the table, staring at his phone. A tech competition. The idea made his stomach churn with nerves, but the thought of a scholarship, a chance to learn and grow, was too good to ignore. At school, Eli approached his counselor, Ms. Bennett, a kind woman with sharp eyes and an encouraging smile. Ms. Bennett, do you know anything about the tech competition downtown? He asked. Her face lit up. Of course. It's a great opportunity. Are you thinking of entering? I'm considering it, Eli said. She gave him an understanding nod. It can be intimidating, but I think you do really well, Eli. I've seen the way you light up when you talk about fixing things. If you decide to go for it, let me know. I can help you with the registration. Eli nodded, feeling the weight of her words. That evening, he told his mom about the competition. I think I want to do it, he said hesitantly. Maggie smiled, pride shining in her eyes. That's my boy. What do you need to get started? Some parts for a project, Eli said. I've got a few ideas, but I'm going to need supplies. Maggie nodded. We'll figure it out. Over the next few weeks, Eli threw himself into preparing for the competition. He spent every free moment sketching designs and testing components. His idea was to build a portable power generator using recycled parts, a project inspired by the work he'd been doing around the building. But challenges came quickly. Some parts were too expensive, and others were impossible to find. He spent hours tinkering with broken appliances from neighbors, salvaging wires and components wherever he could. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the mess of wires and circuit boards in front of him. Nothing seemed to be working, and frustration boiled in his chest. "This is impossible," he muttered, dropping his head into his hands. Maggie came over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I don't have the right parts," Eli said, his voice tight. "Nothing's coming together the way it should. I don't know if I can finish this in time." Maggie hesitated, then gave him a small smile. "Wait here." She left the room, and Eli heard her rummaging through a drawer. When she returned, she was holding a small envelope. "What's that?" he asked. Maggie handed it to him. Inside was a stack of crumpled bills, more money than Eli had seen in a while. "Mom, I can't take this," Eli said, his throat tightening. "Yes, you can," she said firmly. "I've been saving a little here and there. This is important, Eli. You're important. Use it to get what you need." Eli stared at her, overwhelmed by her sacrifice. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Mom." With her support, Eli was able to buy the parts he needed. Slowly, the generator began to take shape. Each wire, screw, and connection brought him closer to the finish line. The night before the competition, he sat in his room, staring at the completed project. The generator hummed softly, its tiny light glowing a steady green. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Eli felt a surge of pride. He thought of his mom, of Mr. Grayson, and of Mrs. Turner. They had all believed in him, even when he doubted himself. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe, too. Whatever happened at the competition, he was ready to give it his all. Eli stood in the crowded hall of the community center, clutching his generator in both hands. The buzz of conversation filled the air, mingling with the hum of machines as competitors set up their projects on long tables. Posters with the words "Tech Innovators of Tomorrow" hung on the walls, the bold lettering both inspiring and intimidating. His heart pounded as he looked around. Some of the other students had sleek, polished projects, robotic arms, advanced drones, and even a 3D printed mechanical clock. Compared to them, Eli's generator, built from salvaged parts, felt small and unassuming. "You belong here," he whispered to himself, repeating the words his mom had told him that morning before he left. Maggie had hugged him tightly at the door, her voice filled with pride. "No matter what happens, Eli, you've already made me proud. Just do your best." Now, standing amidst the competition, Eli tried to hold on to her words. He found his assigned spot and carefully placed the generator on the table. He adjusted the small bulb connected to it, making sure everything was in place. "Hey, nice setup," a voice said beside him. Eli turned to see a boy about his age with messy brown hair and a confident grin. His name tag reads Ryan. "Thanks," Eli said, his voice cautious. "Yours looks impressive, too." Ryan gestured toward his robotic arm, its sleek metallic frame glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Took me months to get it working," he said. "What's yours do?" Eli hesitated, unsure how to explain it in a way that didn't sound overly simple. "It's a portable power generator. It uses recycled parts to store and distribute energy." Ryan nodded, his grin softening. "That's cool. Practical. Judges love stuff like that." Eli managed a small smile, relieved by Ryan's kindness. As the competition began, the judges moved from table to table, listening to each participant's explanation and asking questions. Eli watched nervously as they approached, a man and a woman, both with sharp eyes and professional attire. "Eli Parker?" the woman said, glancing at her clipboard. "Yes, that's me," he said, straightening up. "Tell us about your project," the man said, his tone neutral but encouraging. Eli took a deep breath and launched into his explanation. He described how the generator worked, how it could be used in emergencies or in areas with limited resources. He pointed out the components he had salvaged, explaining how he had repurposed them to make the design cost-effective. The judges nodded, asking a few technical questions that Eli managed to answer. though his hands trembled slightly. When they moved on, Eli exhaled deeply, his nerves slowly settling. He glanced at the other competitors, wondering if his simple project stood a chance. Hours passed, and the competition hall grew quieter as the judges deliberated. Eli sat at his table, fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. He thought of all the late nights he had spent working on the generator, the sacrifices his mom had made, and the encouragement from people like Mr. Grayson and Mrs. Turner. Finally, the announcer stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room, microphone in hand. "Thank you all for participating in today's competition," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The creativity and talent on display have been truly inspiring. Now, we'd like to announce the winners." Eli's heart raced as she began listing names. In third place, Ryan Matthews, for his robotic arm. The crowd clapped as Ryan stepped onto the stage, grinning broadly. He caught Eli's eye and gave him a thumbs up before accepting his certificate. In second place, Eli Parker, for his portable power generator. Eli froze, his mind struggling to process the words. The crowd's applause sounded distant as he slowly stood, his legs shaky. As he walked to the stage, his eyes scanned the audience, and he spotted Maggie near the back, her face glowing with pride. She waved, and Eli felt a surge of warmth and gratitude. He accepted the certificate, the smooth paper cool in his hands. The announcer shook his hand, smiling. "Your project shows incredible ingenuity and practicality," she said. "Well done, Eli." As he stepped down from the stage, he felt lighter, his earlier doubts fading. The second place win came with a partial scholarship to a technical school, and Eli's mind raced with possibilities. After the ceremony, Mr. Grayson approached him, his expression filled with pride. "You did it, Eli," he said. "I knew you could." Eli nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for encouraging me to try." As they spoke, Maggie joined them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without her," Eli said, gesturing to his mom. Maggie pulled him into a hug. "You've earned this, Eli. Every bit of it." That night, as they walked home, Eli carried his generator and certificate with care, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. But instead of exhaustion, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had taken a chance, faced his fears, and found success not just in the prize, but in proving to himself that he was capable. In the quiet of his room, Eli placed the certificate on his desk, next to the old toolbox. The journey ahead still felt daunting, but for the first time, it also felt possible. He was ready for whatever came next. Eli's life began to change after the competition. Though he hadn't won first place, the second-place scholarship opened a door he hadn't dared to dream of. He was still wrapping his mind around the possibility of attending a technical program when a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was a rainy afternoon, and the gray clouds outside cast a muted light over the small apartment. Eli set aside the broken clock radio he had been tinkering with and opened the door. Standing there, holding a bag and an umbrella, was Mr. Grayson. "Mr. Grayson?" Eli asked, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Grayson smiled, his suit slightly damp from the rain. "I hope I'm not intruding, Eli. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by. May I come in?" "Sure. Come in," Eli said, stepping aside. Grayson entered, glancing around the modest apartment. The faint smell of Maggie's chicken soup lingered in the air, and the ticking of an old clock on the wall was the only other sound. Eli's mom appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Oh, Mr. Grayson, what a pleasant surprise," she said warmly. "Can I get you something? Coffee, maybe?" "No, thank you, ma'am," Grayson replied politely. "I won't stay long. I just wanted to bring something for Eli." Eli's eyebrows shot up as Grayson reached into the bag he had brought and pulled out a brand-new toolbox. It was sleek, with a shiny silver finish, and much larger than the one Mrs. Turner had given him. Eli stared at it in awe. "This is for you," Grayson said, holding it out. "I've been watching you grow, Eli. You've got talent, and I think you deserve the right tools to take things further." Eli hesitated, glancing at his mom. Maggie's expression was a mix of pride and gratitude, and she gave him a small nod. "Thank you," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion as he accepted the toolbox. I don't know what to say." It's amazing. Grayson smiled. You've earned it, Eli. And there's more. He reached into his bag again and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. What's this? Maggie asked, stepping closer. Grayson gestured to the folder. It's information about the technical school you've won the scholarship for. I took the liberty of speaking with the admissions office. They're excited to have you, Eli. The program starts in a month. Eli felt a rush of excitement mixed with apprehension. A month, he echoed. That's so soon. Grayson nodded, his expression kind. It'll be a big adjustment, I know, but you've proven that you're ready for it. Eli sat down at the table, flipping through the folder. The glossy pages were filled with pictures of classrooms, workshops, and students working on advanced projects. It looked like a completely different world from the one he knew. Are you sure I can do this? Eli asked, looking up at Grayson. Grayson crouched slightly, meeting Eli's gaze. I've been sure from the moment I saw you fix that laptop, he said. You have a talent, Eli. You just need to trust yourself. Maggie placed a hand on Eli's shoulder, her voice soft but firm. You can do this, sweetheart. I know you can. Eli looked at the folder, then at the toolbox, and finally at his mom and Grayson. He nodded, a small but determined smile forming on his face. Okay, I'll do it. Grayson straightened, his smile widening. That's the spirit. And remember, you're not alone. If you need anything at all, you can call me. As Grayson prepared to leave, Maggie walked him to the door, thanking him again for his kindness. Eli stayed at the table, staring at the toolbox and the folder, his mind racing with possibilities. When Maggie returned, she sat down across from him, her eyes filled with pride. You've got a big journey ahead, Eli, but I know you're ready. Eli nodded slowly. It feels scary, Mom, but also exciting. That's how you know it's worth it, Maggie said, squeezing his hand. That night, Eli carefully unpacked the new toolbox, running his fingers over the smooth handles of the tools inside. Each one felt solid and full of promise. He placed the toolbox beside Mrs. Turner's, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for everyone who had supported him. As he lay in bed, listening to the rain pattering against the window, he thought about the next steps. The program, the challenges, the opportunities, it all felt like a storm waiting to be navigated. But for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. And with the new toolbox, the scholarship, and the unwavering support of his mom and Mr. Grayson, he knew he could face whatever came next. The morning sun filtered through Eli's thin curtains, warming his face as he opened his eyes. Today was the day. The technical school program began, and Eli's stomach churned with a mix of nerves and excitement. He rolled out of bed, careful not to disturb the papers and tools scattered on his desk from last night's final project tweaks. The folder from Mr. Grayson sat neatly in the center, a stark reminder of how far he had come. In the kitchen, Maggie was already up, humming softly as she prepared a modest breakfast. She turned when she saw him, her face lighting up. Morning, sweetheart. Big day today, she said, placing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the table. Eli sat down, his appetite barely keeping pace with his nerves. Yeah, it still doesn't feel real. Maggie sat across from him, her hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee. You've earned this, Eli. You've worked so hard to get here. Just take it one step at a time. Eli nodded, her words giving him a small boost of confidence. After breakfast, he went back to his room and picked out the best outfit he could find: clean jeans, a simple button-up shirt, and his freshly polished sneakers. He packed his new toolbox carefully, ensuring everything was in its place, then slung his backpack over his shoulder. When it was time to leave, Maggie hugged him tightly by the door. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Go show them what you're made of. Eli smiled, her encouragement settling the nerves in his chest. Thanks, Mom. I'll do my best. The bus ride to the technical school felt surreal. As the city blurred past the windows, Eli couldn't help but replay the journey that had brought him here. Fixing Mrs. Turner's flower pot, repairing the heater, winning second place at the tech competition. And now, he was on his way to a place where he could learn, grow, and take his passion to the next level. When he arrived, the campus took his breath away. The building was sleek and modern, its glass windows reflecting the bright morning light. Inside, the halls buzzed with activity. Students carried toolboxes, laptops, and notebooks, their conversations a mix of excitement and technical jargon Eli barely understood. A receptionist greeted him warmly and directed him to the workshop where his first class was being held. The room was massive, with rows of workstations equipped with state-of-the-art tools and equipment Eli had only seen in videos. He found his assigned seat and began unpacking his tools, his hands trembling slightly. The other students chatted in groups, their confidence and familiarity making Eli feel out of place. "First aid jitters?" a voice asked from behind him. Eli turned to see a girl about his age, with curly black hair and a friendly smile. She wore a dark green hoodie and had a small toolbox tucked under her arm. "Yeah," Eli admitted, his voice quiet. "Me too," she said, setting her toolbox down at the workstation next to his. "I'm Zoe. What's your name?" "Eli," he replied, his nerves easing slightly. "Well, Eli, we're in this together," Zoe said with a grin. As the instructor, Ms. Carter, walked in and began the class, Eli's nerves returned. She was tall and confident, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Welcome to the first day of the program," Ms. Carter said, her voice carrying easily over the low hum of conversation. "This course is designed to challenge you, push you, and teach you skills that will set you apart in the field of technology. By the end of it, you'll be able to create, innovate, and solve problems like professionals." Eli's heart pounded as Ms. Carter began explaining their first project, troubleshooting and repairing a broken circuit board. Each student received a board with multiple faults, and they were expected to diagnose and fix the issues using the tools provided. Eli stared at the board in front of him, the maze of tiny components making his head spin. The other students seemed to dive in immediately, their hands moving with practiced ease. Eli hesitated, feeling the weight of doubt pressing down on him. Zoe leaned over, her voice low. "Hey, don't worry. It looks worse than it is. Start small." Eli nodded, her words giving him a foothold. He picked up his multimeter and began testing connections, his hands steadying as he found his rhythm. Ms. Carter moved around the room, observing each student. When she stopped by Eli's workstation, he felt his pulse quicken. "How's it going, Eli?" she asked, her tone neutral. "I think I found a few bad connections," he said, pointing to the board. "I'm working on fixing them now." Ms. Carter nodded, her sharp gaze softening slightly. "Good. Take your time, but stay focused." Eli worked steadily, occasionally glancing at Zoe's progress. She seemed to move effortlessly, her confidence infectious. By the end of the class, Eli had repaired most of the faults on his board. When he powered it on, the small LED lit up, signaling success. A wave of relief washed over him, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "Nice work," Zoe said, giving him a thumbs up. "Thanks," Eli replied, his confidence growing. Ms. Carter announced the end of the session and reminded them to review their work before the next class. As Eli packed up his tools, he felt a sense of accomplishment. On the bus ride home, Eli replayed the day in his mind. He thought about Zoe's encouragement, Ms. Carter's keen observations, and the satisfaction of solving the circuit board problem. When he walked into the apartment, Maggie was waiting for him, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "How was it?" she asked eagerly. Eli set his backpack down and smiled. "It was hard, but I liked it. I think I could do this, Mom." Maggie pulled him into a hug, her pride unmistakable. "I never doubted it for a second." That night, as Eli sat at his desk reviewing the notes he had taken in class, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The path ahead was challenging, but it was also exciting. For the first time, he could see a future beyond the walls of their apartment, a future he was determined to build with his own hands. Eli adjusted the strap of his backpack as he stepped off the bus and onto the campus for the second week of the technical program. The crisp morning air carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass, and the buzz of students' conversations filled the air. Each step he took toward the workshop made his nerves flutter, but it was accompanied by a growing sense of excitement. The first week had been a whirlwind. Eli had spent hours tinkering with circuit boards, soldering wires, and deciphering schematics. Every evening, he returned home with his hands dusty from work and his mind buzzing with everything he'd learned. Inside the workshop, Ms. Carter was already setting up for the day. The room smelled faintly of solder and oil, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was a familiar comfort. Eli greeted Zoe, who was unpacking her toolbox at the workstation beside him. "Ready for another day?" she asked, flashing him a grin. "Yeah, I think so," Eli replied, though the butterflies in his stomach still stirred. Miss Carter clapped her hands, drawing everyone's attention. "Good morning, everyone. Today, we're moving on to a more complex project, rebuilding a device from scratch. You'll work in teams to take apart a broken radio, analyze its components, and restore it to working condition. Pay attention to detail. Every wire, every connection matter." Eli glanced at Zoe, who raised her eyebrows. "Looks like we're partners," she said, sliding her toolbox closer to his. "Guess so," Eli said, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. Miss Carter handed each team a battered radio. The plastic casing was scuffed and cracked, and the tangled mess of wires inside made Eli's head spin. "Where do we start?" Zoe asked, leaning over the workbench. Eli hesitated for a moment, then picked up a screwdriver. "Let's take it apart first and figure out what we're dealing with." Piece by piece, they disassembled the radio, carefully laying each component on the table. Eli's hands moved with precision, the weeks of practice giving him a newfound confidence. "Looks like the speaker's blown," Zoe said, holding up the damaged part. "And the wiring here is completely corroded," Eli added, pointing to a cluster of frayed wires. They worked steadily, troubleshooting each issue. Zoe was quick to identify problems, her sharp eyes catching details Eli sometimes missed, while Eli's steady hands and methodical approach made repairing the components easier. "You've got a good touch," Zoe said as Eli soldered a new wire to the circuit board. "Thanks," Eli replied, feeling a swell of pride. By the time lunch rolled around, they had made significant progress. The radio was starting to come together, though there was still plenty of work left to do. "Nice teamwork," Miss Carter said as she passed their workstation. "You're making good progress. Keep it up." Eli's chest swelled at the praise. He exchanged a glance with Zoe, who gave him a small fist bump. After lunch, they returned to their project with renewed focus. As they tested the newly repaired speaker, Eli held his breath, watching the wires light up in response. "Moment of truth," Zoe said, flipping the power switch. A crackle of static filled the room, followed by the faint sound of a news broadcast. The radio was working. "Yes!" Zoe cheered, throwing her hands in the air. Eli grinned, relief and satisfaction washing over him. He glanced at Ms. Carter, who had been watching from across the room. She gave him a small nod of approval. When the session ended, Eli packed up his toolbox, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. He couldn't wait to tell his mom about the project. On the bus ride home, Eli thought about everything he had learned so far. Each day in the program felt like a new chapter, another step towards something bigger. For the first time, he began to picture himself not just as a kid who fixed things in his apartment building, but as someone who could create, innovate, and make a difference. When he walked into the apartment, Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through mail. She looked up, her face lighting up as soon as she saw him. "How was it today?" she asked. Eli set his backpack down and pulled out the radio, holding it up proudly. "We fixed this. It was completely broken when we started." Maggie's eyes widened as she stood to examine it. "Eli, that's incredible. You're really doing it." Eli nodded, his confidence growing. "It felt amazing, Mom. I'm learning so much, and I feel like I'm actually good at this." Maggie pulled him into a hug, her arms tight around him. "You've always been good at this. Now the rest of the world is seeing it too." Later that evening, Eli sat at his desk, reviewing the notes he had taken during class. The toolbox Mr. Grayson had given him sat beside Mrs. Turner's, both symbols of the support that had brought him this far. Eli picked up a small screwdriver and began tinkering with a broken clock radio he had brought home from the building's laundry room. As he worked, he felt a sense of calm and purpose. The technical program was hard work, but it was the kind of challenge he craved. Each problem he solved, each skill he mastered, brought him closer to a future he had never thought possible. For the first time, Eli felt like he belonged not just in the program, but in the world he was building for himself. And with each passing day, he grew more determined to keep pushing forward. This was only the beginning. The days at the technical program turned into weeks, and Eli found himself thriving in ways he hadn't imagined. Each project brought new challenges, but it also brought new skills, a deeper confidence, and a sense of belonging. His evenings were still spent tinkering in the small apartment, his workbench now overflowing with tools, spare parts, and half-finished repairs. But as much as Eli loved the work, he couldn't ignore the whispers of curiosity from the younger kids in his apartment building. "Eli, what are you working on?" Joey from 2C had asked one afternoon, his wide eyes fixed on Eli's toolbox as he repaired a broken toaster in the building's laundry room. "Just fixing this," Eli had replied, glancing at the boy. "Do you like working with stuff like this?" Joey nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, but I don't have any tools or anything." That conversation stuck with Eli. He remembered being Joey's age, watching videos at the library, and piecing together scraps from old electronics in the trash. What if he could give kids like Joey a head start he hadn't had? One Saturday, Eli decided to do something about it. With Maggie's help, he borrowed a folding table and set it up in Mrs. Turner's garden behind the building. The space was small but cozy, with colorful flowers blooming in pots and a wooden bench nestled under a tree. Eli laid out a collection of old parts, wires, and tools he didn't need anymore, alongside a few small items he had repaired but didn't have use for. A hand-lettered sign read, "Learn to fix things. Free workshop." Mrs. Turner beamed at him as she carried out a tray of lemonade. "You're doing something wonderful, Eli," she said, her voice full of pride. He smiled shyly. "I just want to help like everyone's helped me." It didn't take long for kids from the building to show up. Joey arrived first, followed by his older sister, Mia. A few others trickled in, curious about the setup. "All right, everyone," Eli said, his voice nervous but steady. "We're going to learn how to fix simple things today. Let's start with this flashlight." He handed out small screwdrivers and led the group through the process of opening the flashlight, replacing a corroded battery terminal, and reassembling it. The kids watched intently, their hands fumbling but eager to follow his instructions. By the end of the first session, Joey was proudly holding up the working flashlight. "It's fixed," he exclaimed, his face glowing with excitement. "You did that," Eli said, smiling. The workshop quickly became a weekly event. Word spread, and more kids began to show up, bringing broken toys, clocks, and gadgets. Eli taught them how to identify problems, use basic tools, and approach repairs with patience and creativity. One day, Maggie stood at the edge of the garden, watching the kids gathered around Eli. She had just returned from her shift and looked exhausted, but her face softened as she saw her son explaining something to Joey and Mia, his voice calm and encouraging. Mrs. Turner joined her, holding a glass of lemonade. "He's a natural teacher, isn't he?" Maggie nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "He's always been good at fixing things, but seeing him share it like this, I couldn't be prouder." The workshop wasn't just about teaching the kids. It also reminded Eli of how far he had come. Each question they asked, each smile of triumph when they fixed something, reinforced his belief in the power of community and kindness. One evening, after the workshop had wrapped up, Eli sat in the garden, packing up the tools. The sunset cast a warm glow over the flowers, and the air was filled with the faint scent of lavender from Mrs. Turner's favorite plant. As he worked, Joey approached him, holding an old pair of headphones. "Hey, Illy." "Yeah, Joey?" The boy hesitated, shuffling his feet. "I just wanted to say thanks for teaching us and stuff. It's really fun, and I think I want to be like you when I grow up." Eli felt a lump form in his throat. He set down the toolbox and knelt to Joey's level. "You're going to be even better than me," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Just keep learning and don't give up." Joey grinned and ran off, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts. That night, as Eli sat at his desk, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. The flower pot, the heater, the competition, and the technical program, all of it had shaped him into the person he was becoming. But what stood out most was the support he had received along the way. His mom's unwavering belief in him, Mrs. Turner's kindness, Mr. Grayson's encouragement. Now he was paying it forward, and the impact felt just as meaningful as his own accomplishments. Eli looked at the old toolbox Mrs. Turner had given him, now worn and scratched from years of use. It sat beside the shiny new toolbox from Mr. Grayson, a symbol of the opportunities ahead. He picked up a screwdriver and began tinkering with an old alarm clock, a small smile playing on his lips. He didn't know what challenges the future would bring, but he was ready to face them and to help others along the way. The graduation ceremony for the technical program was held on a bright Saturday afternoon. The workshop, usually filled with the hum of machines and the soft chatter of students, had been transformed into a celebratory space. Balloons and streamers adorned the walls, and rows of chairs faced a makeshift stage. Eli stood near the back of the room, adjusting the collar of his best shirt. His heart raced as he looked at the crowd. His mom sat in the second row, beaming with pride. Mrs. Turner was beside her, dressed in her Sunday best, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Big day, huh?" Zoe said, nudging him playfully. "Eli tfakle nervosle." "Yeah, feels unreal." "You earned it," Zoe said with a grin. "We all did." As the ceremony began, Ms. Carter took the stage. She stood tall and proud, her gaze sweeping over the students who had worked tirelessly over the past months. "Today, we celebrate not just the completion of this program, but the dedication, resilience, and creativity of each of you," she said. "You've proven that with hard work and determination, you can overcome challenges and create something remarkable." Eli felt his chest swell with pride. He thought about the late nights spent tinkering, the countless moments of doubt, and the steady support of his mom, Zoe, and everyone else who had believed in him. When his name was called, Eli walked to the stage, his legs trembling slightly. Miss Carter handed him his certificate, her smile warm. "Great work, Eli," she said quietly. "I'm excited to see where you go from here." Eli nodded, his voice too tight with emotion to respond. As he turned to face the audience, he spotted Maggie wiping her eyes and Mrs. Turner clapping enthusiastically. Mr. Grayson was there too, standing near the back with a proud smile. After the ceremony, the room buzzed with congratulations and laughter. Maggie hugged Eli tightly, her voice filled with pride. "You've come so far, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," Eli said, his voice thick. "I couldn't have done it without you." Mr. Grayson approached, shaking Eli's hand firmly. "Congratulations, Eli. This is just the beginning for you." Eli smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson, for everything." Grayson nodded. "Speaking of beginnings, I wanted to talk to you about the internship we discussed. My company is ready to bring you on board if you're interested." Eli's eyes widened. "An internship? At your company?" Grayson chuckled. "We've seen what you could do, Eli. You've got the skills, and I think you'd make a great addition to the team. You'll get to work on real-world projects and learn from some of the best engineers in the field." Eli looked at Maggie, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love that," Eli said, his voice steady with determination. "Good. We'll sort out the details soon," Grayson said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. That evening, back at the apartment, Eli placed his certificate on his desk, next to the old toolbox Mrs. Turner had given him and the newer one from Mr. Grayson. The sight of them together felt symbolic, past, present, and future all converging in one place. He sat down and opened the old toolbox, pulling out a screwdriver. In the corner of the room sat a battered old radio someone from the building had asked him to fix. As Eli worked, his thoughts wandered to the kids in the building, the workshop in Mrs. Turner's garden, and the internship waiting for him. He thought about the boy he had been unsure of himself, doubting his abilities and the person he was becoming. The journey hadn't been easy, but every challenge had taught him something. He had learned to believe in himself, to trust in the support of those around him, and to pay that kindness forward. Eli tightened the last screw on the radio and flipped the switch. The soft hum of static filled the room before a clear voice came through the speaker. He smiled, the familiar sense of accomplishment warming his chest. This was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Eli felt ready to embrace it fully. With his tools, his determination, and the people who believed in him, Eli knew he could build a future that mattered not just for himself, but for others too. And as the soft glow of the lamp lit his workspace, Eli leaned forward, already thinking about what he would fix next. As Eli leaned back in his chair, the warm hum of the repaired radio filled the room. He glanced at the tools spread across his desk and the certificate proudly displayed nearby. A small smile crossed his face, the spark of hope burning brighter than ever. This is just the beginning, he thought. If you found Eli's journey inspiring and want to follow more uplifting stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more heartwarming tales of resilience, kindness, and hope.